Chris. I'm the founder at Innerfit. As a lot of you already know, we help people feel well and work well. And I think in our experience, whether it's leadership, ED&I, mental health, pure and simple, one of the biggest pain points that we experience, and we share that experience with cultural architects, which is how we describe all of you, is unlocking that budget and buy-in and really leveling up that candidate experience, which is why we're kicking off with today's topic. So I'll get into introductions in a second. One of our pet peeves when it comes to events, maybe pet peeves a bit strong, but I think there's a lot of events out there that sound great, but then you get back to your desk and it's a bit like, now what? Where's the practical element? So hence inviting Nicola Hammond and Chris Truman today. They are definitely two people I associate with the uncensored version and sharing an opinion. So we'll get into that in a second. But Nicola is, People Leader of the Year. We'll start with that to begin with. She is also the People Director at a company called Kairos Group. So we'll be digging in. There's a bit of a common thread through today's session is the case study of Kairos. And Chris Truman is a bit of a talent guru in my eyes. I think we've known each other for about 4 years now. And again, company director at Stormex Recruitment, and just gets a bit of an inside scoop on all things talent. So we'll be digging into that in a second. But Nick, I'm going to come to you first. Paint the picture for us. Where did you start? And in particular dive into the employee experience.
Yeah, of course. So I joined Kairos Group, which I imagine no one will have heard of because I hadn't heard of them until I got approached about joining them nearly 2 years ago. And it is a social media first creative agency. So effectively, we do creative campaigns for large companies such as PepsiCo, Porsche, KFC. And we also have a talent side of the business whereby we have a number of influencers and creators that we work with to monetize their content on social platforms like YouTube. So I joined at a time where they were starting to mature. So they were kind of 7 years in, over 100 employees, starting to have some international growth. And they needed somebody, although they had staff in HR, they didn't have a leader in HR who was experienced and who was able to really set a strategy for them. So went in, looked under the bonnet for the first kind of couple of months and uncovered horrendously high turnover. And bear in mind, I've come from a retail and manufacturing background. So for me to say that means it's pretty bad. You know, high turnover, low engagement, you know, really poor exit interviews. And then in the word of budget, nothing really being spent on anything proactive like learning and development. We were spending huge amounts of money on employee relations, exits, etc. So when you looked across the piece, you know, the data wasn't good. I decided to dig a little further, and I don't know if anyone's ever conducted something called a stay interview. So rather than do exit interviews when somebody's left or leaving, actually interview your current population. And that gave us some really incredible insight, but it made us very aware of the fact that we were likely to start losing a lot of our key talent.
Thanks, Nick. So we'll dig into where you went after that, because you've obviously painted the picture there. But then Chris, we just mentioned about employee experience. You've got a lens on candidate experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think my view is always to challenge stuff as far as I possibly can. And actually, I think while we talk about these two things as sort of two separate entities and most often two separate definitions, I would always try and talk to our kind of consultancy-based clients about reshaping that and repositioning it, because all of what Nicola is talking about is obviously, well, retention after she'd come in, she'd looked at it. It's the people who already exist in the business. But from my standpoint, retention is shaped by someone's experiences through a recruitment process. So that candidate experience piece really, in most definitions, starts from the point where you see an advert, you kind of obviously get a feel for the vibe and the culture of that business, which starts to be defined through how it's worded and, you know, what people's experiences then go on. So that slide typifies what we talk about, you know, the first contact being the advert, the interviews, how it feels, the offer process, the pre-boarding, etc. And that typically after someone is inducted is where most people's definition of candidate experience sort of ends. But I think probably why I try to kind of reshape it, and my reshape actually is to sit there and say, well, it's all candidate experience, is because in a world where talent is so hard to come by, and your brand and your culture and all of the feels and vibes of it needs to hit everybody from first moment. And really the problem that exists probably where retention is probably at its hardest in that onboarding moment, if you're not getting everything right and joining the two, then frankly, your employee is my candidate, or someone's candidate, obviously. Anyway, so the reality is you're kind of almost looking at the risk of losing someone because of what you're doing through the recruitment process, I guess.
And we'll get into the Kairos experience in a second, Nick. But Chris, like, I suppose follow-up question there around what you've seen, because you've shared some stories with me in the past. And if we think about the quiet quitting phenomenon, whether it's amped up, who knows? But what are you kind of seeing? And have you got any stories that might bring that to life for everyone?
Yeah, so I think, part of the reason that you've obviously come to this sort of seminar, I suspect, as a topic, is that really what is a large scale volume reason for people to come into the market at the moment is that feeling that they've been missold to, I guess. So something that's existed through the recruitment process, whether it be the kind of the definition of the role, whether it be the feel of the culture of the company and how that's been portrayed, whether that be online or what they've been told, doesn't match up to what they then receive when they arrive. And that can become apparent quite quickly, and quite quickly becomes what they would then define as toxic, really. Alongside, I think, the most popular concept at the moment, which is that sort of general toxicity of kind of culture at leadership or lack of leadership development and sort of the way that people are managed. And I think it would be unfair of me to come to something like this without almost deviating from the point. Sorry, Chris, but ultimately, if we're talking about people's reasons for leaving businesses, that's a big one. But ultimately, at the moment, cash very, very much is king. Quite frankly, we can't get away from that, and current salaries and market conditions are utterly bonkers, quite frankly. But development and L&D, I think, is probably also a really kind of obvious topic to kind of highlight from my standpoint that we hear all the time as well.
Do you want to pick up straight off of what Chris just said, Nick, for Kairos?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were suffering from probably a lot of what Chris has talked about. And I think from an agency perspective, we were multi-award winning, for our campaigns and things like that. And I think we hired a talent acquisition manager whilst I was on serving my notice, so before I joined. So we joined at quite a similar time. So we were able to tackle a lot of this together, not just from an internal perspective, but from an external sort of talent acquisition perspective. And we just said, there's no point bringing really great people in because we didn't have an environment that people wanted to stay. Effectively, they were drawn in by our amazing brands, the people that we worked with, and the exciting campaigns. But the reality of, hang on a minute, there's no training, where's my career path? There wasn't regular cycles with things like remuneration and reward. The benefits were so, we weren't doing anything in the diversity and inclusion space. So actually, what was the reason to get people to stick? So it's all, all of the points, as Chris said, very much absolutely things like cash is king. But you need to make sure that you've got an environment that is appealing, that people actually want to stay in, which is obviously part of the challenge that I was faced with, that we already had this amazing brand, but how do you make the external perception, how do you make, the internal perception as good as the external and actually makes people want to stay within your business?
Because I think us talking about Instagram versus reality a little bit, and then also you putting retention and linked to that, I suppose, candidate experience and employee experience at the heart of the people strategy, which links to the first bullet point here on Strategy House. So maybe we'll just dig into that a little bit now.
Yeah, and in regards to the Instagram versus reality, we actually use that in our presentation. So we literally dug through all our exec boards posts on LinkedIn, and we said, you're saying, oh, blah, 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 we no longer do this, or I no longer do that. Actually, this is what the engagement survey is saying, which is an absolute polar opposite from actually what you've just put on LinkedIn, that we do or we don't do. So we actually put in front of their face, you know, the reality of what was going on, of their perception of the company versus what actually people really felt inside. And it was very hard hitting. But unfortunately, if you want to get budget, if you want to have an impact, if you really want to show what you're doing, you are going to have to be a little bit controversial, and it's going to feel uncomfortable, you know, but this is absolutely what you need to do. So in terms of the process that we went through, and in terms of us also wanting to be practical, we will show you examples of these as we move along. But I built effectively a strategy house. Some of you may have seen this. It can be used for any kind of strategy. But effectively, all this is about is being really clear about what your vision is, what your mission is, what your goals are, and then ultimately you need to have a foundation. There is no point doing incredible learning and development and D&I if you can't pay people properly, for example. So you've got to make sure that you're really clear end to end on what the challenges are in your business and the areas that you need to focus on.
Thanks, Nick. Just before we miss it, could you just share a little bit on the Christmas party? And I'm not saying this is for everyone, but I think when it comes to getting budget and buy-in, I think it's just an interesting one for people to hear.
Yeah, so it's very much on those moments of you know, the budget you want, we're going to give it to you. Brilliant. But you're going to have to pay for the Christmas party. And I literally came back there, said, no, I am absolutely not paying for the Christmas party, because if we've got all of these challenges with turnover and happiness and engagement and all these Glassdoor reviews, if you think it is best to spend a third of our budget on the Christmas party, I was like, you've got another thing coming. So I said, I will take that budget, but this is what we'll be spending it on. We either cancel the Christmas party or you find the budget from elsewhere. And I did not budge at all on that. I was absolutely unapologetic about that.
Can I just add a similar example from my background as well? Because ultimately we are still seeing in the market an absolute dead load of attraction pieces that are all table tennis tables and games consoles and all of these sorts of things that people think young people want. Now, in a lot of instances, that's true. But unfortunately, they're still being used as a power tool. So, and actually, I used to be, unfortunately, charged with wielding that power tool in my previous business, whereby the MD had kind of created this branding piece and this, in what he thought was an EVP piece, around attracting people to bring, you know, their kind of A game, but also play their A game on the table tennis table. Lo and behold, they missed their targets. He banned it. And you're like, what? And it became this massive point of toxicity within the business because there was clearly no trust there. And that's still so prevalent out there. It's these glossy facades with actually underbellies of owners or CEOs of startup scale-ups who don't give a damn and will quite happily take stuff away once they've advertised it. So toxic.
Yeah.
Chris, maybe if you keep going on that piece, because I know you've placed quite a few. I think I even saw a post on your LinkedIn about placing a senior HRD at the moment, but I guess you're just a sounding board for quite a few people, and I know for sure one person on this call. So could you just share some of perhaps an insight into the conversations you've had with HR directors, for example, who have managed to move the needle a little bit and get genuine buy-in in the right direction as opposed to what you just referred to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the successes that I hear, and when I've been used as a sounding board, as you say, is twofold. One of which quite often, most often these days, comes from data, to be fair. So CEOs, owners, they need evidence. They want evidence, and they want to, I mean, look, Nick talks of all things retention figures and change pieces and stuff, but ultimately they want to know how that's going to affect them. I mean, there's probably the most popular case study of candidate experience that you could just Google quite comfortably, which is the Virgin Media one. And this was back in 2017 or something. And, you know, a really bright spark head of talent came into Virgin Media and quite quickly worked out that bad candidate experience was costing Virgin Media $5 million on an annual basis, because effectively they were hiring so many people and those people's experiences were so bad, whether it be through lack of contact or terrible interviews, you know, ghosting, all of these popular things that we hear about, that they would not only switch from Virgin Media to different suppliers, but they would tell their families to do exactly the same as well. And he effectively presented these figures to the CEO, who obviously thought, well, we can't afford that. And that's bigger business piece. But Nick's quite rightly talking about the retention stuff. And I think the second piece is just listening to people. Those kind of CPOs, HRDs who instill a culture of listening, whereby employees actually start for the first time to feel like they're being listened to rather than dictated to. Because I think probably one of the things that stands out the most following COVID, from my standpoint, is that people now, or we've always felt, right, but ultimately people now know what they feel and they care about what they feel like in a work environment. And ultimately, if they're not being listened to and those things that are being told or sold to them aren't being actioned upon, they feel that and they care about that, you know? So at that point, I think twofold: data, firstly, evidence, really, but also showing that you are instilling a culture of listening and influencing then probably the leaders of that business to ensure that they do the same.
And I think from a practical perspective, I did exactly that. So I think it's really important when you've been given this budget to actually show where it's going. So I did a quarterly wrap up and I said, this is what we said we were going to do. This is what we've done. And this is the results it's had. And not just data, because again, you need to understand what makes your executive team tick. Is it data? Is it money? Is it comments? Is it people's feelings? Is it a mixture of all? So we used to put in a mixture of data, comments that people had said, you know, comments that have come forward to HR. And I think in terms of, you know, Chris's advice around being listened to, we did absolutely that. So might sound basic, but one of the things I needed to implement when I came in was an all company meeting. We didn't have that. And we've used that then as a platform to say, actually, you said you want more flexibility. As of today, we're reducing the working week by 5 hours and we're now implementing flexi hours, and this is how it's going to work. So we were very overt about us saying the changes we've made off the back of what's being requested or feedback. So there was no confusion about where it had come from, as Chris said, to make sure people know they're actually being listened to.
I heard a great case study, like literally just yesterday, from a CPO I was talking to, who had been on the look for a new role, and effectively had made it an absolute condition of her starting within the new role that she spent one of the first 2 weeks with the talent team. And I thought that was the first time I've heard something quite as kind of stern as that, but one of her absolute must-haves. I must see how this team works, because effectively, whether it be through the attraction piece or the development piece that the talent team are obviously kind of in charge with, if that's not working, we're all doomed.
Yeah.
Blimey. True though. Nick, I'm going to come to you again if that's all right, because I think it links to the coalition piece. And Matt, I have seen your question in the chat as well, so we'll get to that in about 5 or so minutes. We just got a little bit more insight to share. And Nick, if you could share a little bit on how you built your coalition at Kairos.
Yeah, of course. So I think it's really important to, you know, really sit back and reflect who's going to support you and get in there early. So I cherry picked a few people I knew who were either supportive of me or supportive of the HR agenda, you know, and made them feel a bit special by saying, look, I want to share this with you. I'd love to get your thoughts, you know, early doors before the meeting. You know, please share any feedback from your previous companies, etc. And that then naturally built support in the room because they've been brought in early. Equally, understanding who's going to derail you. So again, I look back on what made people tick. You know, I'll be honest, there's some people in my business, people is not top of their agenda. And I'm sure that'll be the same for most or a lot of you. So actually, what does make them tick? Is it money? Is it fame? You know, what is it that you can then push those buttons in that presentation? And that's what I mean by what really matters to them. Some of this stuff, it's, you know, we wouldn't naturally talk necessarily from a people perspective about things like money. My CEO's ultimate goal is to have a Netflix documentary about them. Now, I'll be honest, that terrifies me. I don't know who the hell he's going to get to play me, and that fills me with dread. However, you know, that makes him tick. So I made sure that was a fundamental part of my strategy of like, if that is a goal of his, how does this ladder up to get us there? And then I think really understanding that, you know, your commercials, and I know this sounds like a very sweeping statement to make, but what is it? And we didn't have a strategy when I got there. So when I got there, I was asking, what's your strategy for this year? What's your 5-year strategy? And they all just looked at me. So I said, right, let's just take it back. Let's not talk strategy. Where do you want to be by the end of the year? What does good look? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What does this company look like? So really get under the skin. And if you've got more than one executive, or you've got an executive board, like interview them all, because they're all going to have different things they want out of the company. So listen to the language that they're using, the things that really matter to them, and make sure you play to those points in your presentation.
And I know some of you are already doing this. I think Vicky, we spoke, Marty, we spoke a little bit, and it was interesting to hear the role of corridor conversations, and almost before getting to that pitch moment, you've kind of won or lost it a little bit before then as well. So Nick, if you could just continue the thread on Kairos, and we'll share a little bit on the results, and then Chris, I'll come to you for kind of one last insight or two.
Yeah, of course. So open with an attention grabber, and I don't know if you just want to flick on one slide, Chris, and then we can flip back, because this is what I opened my people strategy with. Because looking at our turnover, we wasted a minimum of 2.5 million a year purely on turnover, by losing and replacing people, and then the impact on losing work and having to reinduct people. So I said, if you are happy spending 2.5 million a year down the drain, and you're happy with this level of turnover, we don't need to listen to the rest of this deck. But if you want to change this number this time next year, we need to keep. So open with something really, it doesn't have to be controversial. Some of you may be in really positive environments where actually your challenge is, we've got loads of high performers, what do we do with them? But find something that's a real attention grabber that you can open with. I don't know if you want to flip back, and then we'll go through.
Yeah, for sure.
So give a reality check of where you are today. Mine was very hard hitting. You know, my picture was not a pretty one to paint in terms of, you know, how quickly people started looking to leave for another job, you know, the level of tenure for our turnover, what our demographics were, the lack of D&I. It was not pretty, but you need to really be clear about what the situation is right now and why you need to change it. And as I say, you might have positives, and that's great, but you need to share the reality of where you are today. Then my next biggest advice is use storytelling. So I don't know if that's something that any of you are familiar with, but Chris, you can flick a couple on if you want. But I basically, bear in mind, this presentation was just over a year ago. I said to them, it's December 2024. And I opened and I talked to them about what the company looks and feels like. So I talked about the fact that we're just being teed up for a Netflix documentary. We've flown everybody in, you know, from Asia, from America. You know, this is what it feels like. And I really painted the picture of what this really great buzzing company looked like off the back of us doing X, Y, and Z that's in the strategy. The other piece as well, you can flick forward on if you want, Chris. I mentioned in the strategy hats about getting the basics right, and don't underestimate this. As I say, we had issues, for example, with our payroll, with our pension plan. There is no point doing all this amazing stuff if you can't get the basics right. So we called this phase mowing the lawn. And this is often high volume, like low impact work, but don't underestimate, you know, the importance of getting this right, and also calling out the fact that this stuff needs to be done, that it's not all just about the sexy big strategy stuff, but actually there's some fundamental basics we need to fix to get the hygiene factors right.
Thanks, Nick. And then Chris, I know we're close to Q&A as well, because I really want to make sure that people like Matt and anyone else who's got questions have got a chance to either share an experience or ask a question. But Chris, I mean, building on that, obviously retention was kind of at the heart of it. And I think the stat on 2.5 million is pretty mind-blowing, and we'll get on to company size, etc., and growth in a second. But from your experience talking with talent leaders, HRDs, etc., have you got any words of wisdom or insights for everyone on the call on how they might be able to amp up that element of their pitch, or use something that's underappreciated about candidates to really get progress moving along? Because I was talking to someone this morning who the C-suite, it wasn't quite clicking, you know. So that's the situation. Have you got any insight?
I might, do you know what? I might come from it from a slightly different standpoint, if you don't mind, because I think from my side of things, this pitch is all, it's all well and good, but ultimately you've got to have people who are going to listen to that. And make no mistake, you know, everybody on this call obviously is a senior HR person with great influencing skills. I get that, but I'm constantly asked, about questions that people can ask before they get into a role, if you like, and things that they could sort of do maybe to find out whether those people are going to listen to them before they get into that role. And the most they always come to me and say, look, should I ask about the budget? What budget am I going to get? And my view is actually quite different. So whether it's about kind of amping it up or identifying if you're going to be able to amp it up before you actually get in there, perhaps, is more like asking softer questions. So my advice would always be to ask softer questions than just sort of defined what's my budget going to be, because you really need to see the whites of someone's eyes as to what their attitude towards culture is. And I had a great interview with Emma Hayes, the Chelsea women's manager, a couple of weeks ago, who was talking about every single job she had ever gone into, asking the question about of that employer as to whether they perceived the culture at the top, on the top floor, to be different to the culture on the lower floors of the building. And I thought that was great. I also like a question around asking someone whether they would encourage their friends and family to work within the business and why. I think that's great, because you kind of put it back on something that's inherently personal to them. And it's very difficult to lie about that, quite frankly, when you're talking about friends and family. And then finally, I always think a great question would be to ask them how the business takes responsibility itself for the success of its employees. Because we are now in a world, and again, perhaps this is a practical takeaway, we are now in a world whereby people expect that the business looks after them. The business develops them. We used to be in a world, certainly when I grew up, perhaps less so you, Chris and Nick, whereby it was all on me as the employee. You know, it was all on the people that worked for us, and they were expected and demanded of everything. Now it's the other way around. They're really trying to ascertain perhaps what they do themselves to get success from their employees during that onboarding and interview process.
Thank you, Chris. And then Nick, final thought before we get into a bit of Q&A. I know it's obviously worked. You've still got challenges, I think, but to a large extent, you've had some big results.